The father's justice. I saw Sophia standing behind my workbench, not browsing, not waiting, but opening the second drawer of my filing cabinet like she already knew what she was looking for. The late afternoon light from the front window barely reached the back room, leaving her face half in shadow as she flipped through insurance documents, pausing just long enough to take photos with her phone. She didn't hear me step in, didn't notice the silence shift, just kept moving with that same calm precision I'd seen before, the kind that turns people into numbers. Then she said it quietly, almost to herself. Once this transfers, everything changes. Not a question, not a doubt, just a conclusion. I didn't confront her, didn't make a sound, because in that moment, I understood exactly what she had been doing and how far she had already gone. I had been waiting for this moment for 18 months, but what I didn't know yet was how much she had already taken and what she was planning to take next. My name is James Caldwell. I am 66 years old, and for 38 of those years, I have stood behind the same narrow wooden bench, repairing clocks and watches that most people would have already given up on. The shop sits on a quiet street where the afternoon light filters through the front glass in a slow, golden angle, catching dust in the air like suspended time. Every shelf holds something that once mattered to someone. A pocket watch carried through a war, a mantel clock that outlived its owner, a wristwatch that stopped the moment a life changed. I don't just fix mechanisms. I listen to them, to the uneven ticks, the hesitation in a worn gear, the silence that tells you something inside has finally given out. Rebecca Caldwell, my wife, understood that better than anyone. She wasn't trained for this work, but she had a patience that most craftsmen spend a lifetime trying to learn. In the evenings, after the shop closed, she would sit beside me under the soft lamp above the bench, sleeves rolled back, her fingers steady as she cleaned each piece with a care that made the whole room quieter. We didn't speak much during those hours. We didn't need to. The rhythm of the tools, the faint ticking of restored movements, the shared understanding that we were preserving something invisible, that was enough. When she passed, the shop didn't change. Not on the surface. The sign out front stayed the same. The drawers stayed organized the way she left them. Her tools still wrapped in cloth inside the top cabinet. But the space held more than work after that. It held memory, decisions, the weight of everything we had built together over nearly 4 decades. To anyone else, it might look like a small business sitting on valuable property, but to me, it is time made visible, measured not in profit, but in years of showing up, of staying when things were hard, of choosing to keep something alive when it would have been easier to let it stop. People sometimes mistake quiet for weakness, especially when it comes from someone who doesn't rush to speak. They look at a man standing still and assume he doesn't see what's happening around him. But I have spent my life watching small movements, noticing what shifts by half an inch, hearing what changes by a fraction of a second. Observation is not passivity, it is control, held back until the moment it's needed. And over the years, I have learned something that no textbook ever teaches, that the most dangerous problems are not the ones that break loudly, but the ones that drift, slowly, quietly, until one day you realize something has already been set in motion, and the question is no longer if it will happen, but when. After Rebecca was gone, it was Andrew who kept the rhythm of the house from falling apart, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady ones that never asked for recognition. He started coming by every Sunday morning without being told, always at the same time, the sound of his car pulling up just as the first light settled across the front window of the shop. He would let himself in with the spare key, set a paper bag on the counter, coffee still warm, pastries wrapped in thin white paper, and give a quiet nod, like he didn't want to disturb anything that might still be holding together. Andrew Caldwell has always been that kind of man. Careful with people, careful with his words, the sort who listens all the way through before he answers. He built his life step by step, studying, working, choosing a path that made sense, structural engineering, something solid, something measurable. But what mattered more to me was not what he built out there. It was how he showed up here. He never asked about the shop as an asset, never once treated it like something to be divided or evaluated. To him, it was simply part of us, something that existed the way a family does, not because of value, but because it had always been there. On those Sunday mornings, we moved easily around each other, the way people do when they've spent years sharing the same space. He would take off his jacket, roll up his sleeves, and stand beside me at the bench, watching closely as I worked. Sometimes he'd hand me tools before I asked. Sometimes he'd just stand there, studying the movement of a gear, like he was trying to understand not just how it worked, but why. We didn't need to fill the silence, the ticking of the clocks, the soft scrape of metal on metal, the occasional hum of traffic outside. It was enough. There were moments when I caught something of Rebecca in him, the way he leaned slightly forward when he focused, the way his hands slowed when precision mattered. He never said he missed her in so many words, but it was there in the way he lingered a little longer before leaving, in the way he sometimes looked at the shelf above the bench and then looked away. Grief doesn't always speak. Sometimes it just stays in the room, quiet, waiting for something familiar to hold on to. For a long time, that was our balance. Simple, steady, unspoken. He would come in. We would work or talk or sit in the same space without needing to explain anything. And then he would leave with a quiet, "See you next week," like it was understood that next week would come exactly the same. And for a while it did. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just time moving forward the way it's supposed to. Looking back now, I realize how consistent it all was, how predictable in the best way, and how easily something like that can shift without announcing itself. Because when a routine holds for long enough, you stop asking whether it could ever change until the first time it does. Andrew brought Sophia into the shop on a Saturday afternoon in early spring, the kind of day when the light falls clean through the front glass and settles across the floor in long, quiet lines. She stepped in just behind him, one hand resting lightly on his arm, her posture composed, her expression already arranged before she spoke. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, reaching out with both hands as if warmth could be measured. "This place is beautiful. It has so much character." Her voice was smooth. Practiced, not insincere, but precise, in a way that suggested she understood the effect of every word before she said it. I thanked her, and watched the way her eyes moved, not drifting, not taking in the room the way most people do when they're curious, but scanning. She paused briefly at the display case, then at the shelves along the wall, then at the back where the workbench sat partially hidden behind the curtain. It wasn't admiration. It was assessment. I had seen that look before, from estate evaluators, from attorneys reviewing assets, people who didn't see objects, only categories, value, condition, potential. Andrew was talking, explaining how long the shop had been here, how his mother used to help, how the place had stayed the same for years. Sophia nodded at the right moments, asked questions that sounded thoughtful. "Have you ever considered expanding?" she said, her gaze still moving across the room. "Or maybe modernizing the front. There's a lot of untapped potential in spaces like this." The words were reasonable, even helpful on the surface. But there was something in the way she said, potential, that flattened everything it touched. I gave a small smile, the kind you use when you don't want to turn a moment into something heavier than it needs to be. "We've kept things the way they work," I said. She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing that answer. "Of course," she replied, soft but firm. "But sometimes keeping things the same can mean missing opportunities. Not a challenge, not quite, but close enough to feel it." Unquote. Andrew didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he chose not to. He stood there with that quiet pride I had seen before, looking between us like he wanted both worlds to fit together, without friction. Sophia moved closer to the counter, her fingers brushing lightly against the wood as she leaned in just enough to suggest interest without committing to it. "It must be valuable, being in this location for so long," she added, almost casually, as the thought had just occurred to her. I answered simply, "Kept it general. Said it had been a good place to work." She nodded again, but her eyes didn't settle. They kept moving, calculating distances, angles, possibilities. I told myself I was reading too much into it, that this was how people like her thought, how they were trained to see the world. Organization, efficiency, growth, and none of that is wrong on its own. But as she stood there, framed by the soft light coming through the window, speaking in a tone that never rose or fell too far in either direction, I felt something shift, just slightly, the way a clock does when a gear begins to slip out of alignment. Not enough to stop it, not enough to name the problem, just enough to know that something, somewhere inside the mechanism, wasn't moving the way it should. And the question I couldn't quite answer yet was whether I was imagining it, or whether I had just seen the first sign of something already beginning. It didn't begin with demands, it began with questions, the kind that sound harmless if you don't listen closely enough. Sophia would sit at the small table near the front window on Sunday mornings, a cup of coffee untouched in her hand, watching the light move across the floor as if she were studying something beneath it. "How long have you owned the building?" she asked once, her tone light, almost conversational. I told her, gave her the year, the story behind it, the way Rebecca and I had signed the lease before we ever knew if the business would survive. Sophia nodded, smiling politely, but her eyes stayed fixed, waiting for more than I was willing to offer. A week later, it was a different question. Same tone, same stillness. "Have you ever thought about retirement?" she said, glancing toward the back where the workshop sat. "I mean, it's a lot of work for one person, especially over time." There was no urgency in her voice, no pressure, just a quiet suggestion that carried further than it should have. I answered the way I always had, that I hadn't thought much about stepping away, that the shop still needed me. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering that answer against something else. "Of course," she said softly. "But sometimes it's not about what we need. It's about what makes sense, long term." Andrew was there, standing near the counter, listening, without interrupting. He didn't respond at first, just shifted his weight, his hands resting in his pockets the way he does when he's thinking through something. Then he added, almost carefully, "It might be worth talking about at some point, Dad, just to have a plan." The words were measured, reasonable, but they didn't quite belong to him. Not in the way they were framed, not in the way they landed. Over the next few weeks, the questions continued, never repeated exactly, but always circling the same space. Property values, market trends, how the area had changed. Sophia spoke about opportunities with a kind of calm certainty, like she was outlining something already in motion. "Places like this don't stay this way forever," she said one afternoon, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter without really touching it. "At some point, someone has to decide what comes next." Andrew began to echo parts of it. Not directly, not all at once, but in fragments. He'd check his phone more often during our time together, glance at it mid-conversation as if something elsewhere required his attention. One morning, he mentioned that he and Sophia had been thinking about the future more intentionally. The phrase sat in the air longer than it should have. I looked at him, waiting for him to explain what that meant, but he didn't, just nodded slightly, like the meaning was already understood. The visits changed, not suddenly, but steadily. What had been every Sunday became every other week, then once a month, then a message, instead of a visit. "Busy this weekend," he'd write, or, "We've got plans, I'll come by next time." The shop felt different on those mornings, quieter, in a way that wasn't just about sound. I kept working, kept the same routine, but the absence began to take shape in small places, the empty space beside the bench, the second cup of coffee, left untouched. When Andrew did come by, there was a hesitation that hadn't been there before. He'd start a sentence, then adjust it halfway through, choosing words more carefully, as if someone else might be listening even when they weren't. "Sophia thinks," he'd say, then stop, correct himself. "We were talking about how the shift was subtle, but it was there. A slight distance between what he used to say and what he was saying now." One afternoon, as we stood side by side at the bench, He looked at the tools laid out in front of us and said, almost casually, "You know, a place like this could probably be worth a lot more than it brings in." He didn't look at me when he said it, kept his eyes on the movement in his hands, turning a small screw with more force than necessary. That wasn't how Andrew spoke. Not about this place. Not about anything that mattered. I didn't challenge him. Didn't push back the way I might have if the words had come from somewhere else. Instead, I let the moment pass. Watched the way he set the tool down, the way his shoulders tightened just slightly after he spoke. Because it wasn't just what he was saying. It was how unfamiliar it felt, like hearing a familiar clock strike the hour at the wrong time. And the more it happened, the clearer it became. These weren't conversations anymore. They were adjustments, small, precise shifts being made over time. The kind you don't notice until the alignment is already off. And by the time you do, the question is no longer whether something has changed, but how far it's already gone. Diane Foster doesn't raise her voice unless something is already wrong. So when she stepped into the back room that afternoon and paused at the edge of my workbench, I knew before she said anything that this wasn't routine. The shop was quiet, late in the day, the front door locked, the last of the light slipping through the glass and fading across the floor. She kept her tone low, careful. "James, Sophia was here earlier. She said she was picking something up for Andrew." A brief pause. Then, "I told her you weren't in, but she asked to use the restroom." Diane glanced toward the hallway behind the curtain, then back at me. She was back there longer than she needed to be. I set the tool down in my hand without making a sound, not because I was surprised, but because something in the way Diane said it told me this wasn't just a passing concern. "How long?" I asked. "About 15 minutes, she replied. "Maybe a little more." That was long enough. Long enough for someone to move through a space they didn't belong in. Long enough to look for something specific. I didn't rush to the back. Didn't make it obvious that anything had shifted. Instead, I walked there the way I always do. Steady, unhurried, letting my eyes adjust to the dimmer light beyond the curtain. At first glance, everything appeared as it should. The workbench clear, tools in place, drawers closed. But that's the thing about a room you've worked in for decades. You don't see it the way others do. You don't see objects. You see alignment. The second drawer of the filing cabinet was not fully closed, just a fraction of an inch out of place. The small box where I keep older invoices had been moved slightly to the left. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. A stack of papers near the back edge of the desk had been shifted. The top sheet angled differently than I left it. These were not accidents. They were adjustments made by someone who didn't know what the room looked like when it was undisturbed. I opened the drawer slowly, not searching, just confirming. Files were intact. Nothing missing at first glance. But that wasn't the point. The point was that someone had been there, going through documents that were never meant to be seen by anyone outside this room. I closed the drawer again, pressing it fully into place this time, restoring the line so it sat flush with the cabinet. Diane remained near the doorway, watching me without asking questions. She knows better than to fill the silence when something needs to settle first. "Did she take anything?" she asked after a moment. I shook my head slightly. "Not that I can see." That was the truth, at least on the surface. What mattered more was what she had been looking for, and why she felt comfortable enough to look for it here. I didn't call Andrew, didn't mention it that evening or the next day. There's a difference between reacting and responding, and I've learned over time that the first one usually benefits the person who made the move. Instead, I went back to the front of the shop, finished the last of the paperwork, and closed up at the usual time, as if nothing had happened. That night, I sat at the small desk in the corner of my house with a blank notebook in front of me, the kind with a dark cover and plain pages that don't draw attention. I wrote the date, then a short entry, time, what Diane had seen, what I had found. No conclusions, just facts. I kept the writing clean, precise, the way you document something you know may matter later. Because that was the moment something became clear, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but with a quiet certainty that settled in and stayed. This wasn't curiosity anymore, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had crossed into a space they had no reason to enter, looking for something they had no right to access. And whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop on its own. So I made a decision, not to confront, not to accuse, but to watch, to give it time, to let the pattern reveal itself fully before I moved. Because if someone is willing to step into your space once, they rarely stop there, and the only question left was how far she was planning to go, and what she thought she would find when she got there. I didn't act the next day, or the day after that. I gave it a week, then another, letting the routine settle back into place while I watched for anything that didn't quite return the way it should. When I finally made the call, it was on a Wednesday evening after closing, and the shop was dim except for the single lamp above the bench. Kevin Brooks answered on the second ring, his voice steady, unhurried. We met the following morning before I opened, sitting across from each other at the small table near the front window, the early light still low and gray. I told him everything, not as a story, but as a sequence. What Diane had seen, what I had found, what had been said in the weeks before. He didn't interrupt, just listened, then asked a few direct questions, names, addresses, patterns. When he was done, he nodded once and said, "Give me time." At the same time, I reached out to Thomas Reed, my attorney for nearly 2 decades. His office hasn't changed much over the years. Same shelves, same quiet, the smell of paper and polished wood that never quite fades. I laid out the situation the same way I had with Kevin, carefully, without assumptions. Thomas didn't react immediately. He leaned back slightly, hands folded, considering each piece as if placing it into position. Then, "We don't move yet," he said. "We build structure first." He began adjusting the estate documents, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to ensure that nothing could transfer without conditions being met. Layers, he called it, protection that only matters when tested. I started keeping records that same week, not casually, not from memory, but with intention. A dark notebook sat on the corner of my desk, and every entry followed the same pattern: date, time, what was said, where it happened. No interpretation, no emotion, just facts. Conversations that felt slightly off, questions that came too prepared, pauses that lasted longer than they should. Over time, the pages filled, not quickly, but steadily, like a pattern emerging line by line. Kevin's updates came quietly, never more than necessary, always specific. Sophia had met with an attorney named Angela Price, not in an office, but in public spaces, a cafe downtown, a table near the window where conversations blend into background noise. They met more than once, not by accident. Kevin noted the frequency, the timing, the way they spoke, leaning in just enough to avoid being overheard, but not enough to suggest secrecy to anyone passing by. A few weeks later, he brought something more concrete. Confirmation that discussions had moved beyond general advice. There were references to property valuation, to timing, to what Angela had described as transition scenarios. My shop, not as a place of work, but as an asset to be positioned. The language was careful, always framed in hypotheticals, but the direction was clear. Then, there was the matter of my health. Kevin mentioned it without emphasis, as if he were placing another piece on the table. Sophia had contact with someone at an insurance office, a connection from a previous transaction. Information had been shared, not formally, not on record, but enough to suggest she was tracking something that wasn't hers to follow. Medication, routine checkups, details that meant nothing on their own, but together formed a timeline that had nothing to do with concern. I didn't respond outwardly, didn't change my behavior, or bring any of it into conversation. Instead, I adjusted my position, not physically, but in the way I observed. Every question Sophia asked, every comment that sounded reasonable on the surface, I listened to it twice. Once for what it was, and once for what it was doing. The notebook continued to fill, page after page of small entries that, taken alone, meant very little. But together, they began to form something structured, something that could be understood without explanation. Kevin gathered what could be verified, Thomas reinforced what could be protected, and I remained where I had always been, inside the same space, watching the same details, letting time move at its own pace. Because control doesn't come from acting first. It comes from knowing when not to. And over those months, as the pattern became clearer and the pieces aligned with a precision I hadn't expected, one thing settled in with quiet certainty. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about timing. And the only question left was whether she realized how much had already been seen and how much had already been set in place before she made her next move. I hadn't opened that clock in years, not since Rebecca placed it on the shelf above my workbench and told me, without explanation, that it should stay there. It was late when I finally reached for it. The shop already closed, the front lights off, only the small lamp casting a narrow circle across the bench. The case was smooth under my hands, the wood worn just enough to feel familiar. I set it down carefully, turning it slightly so the back panel faced me, the faint ticking inside steady, unchanged. At first, there was nothing unusual, the movement clean, the components exactly as I remembered them. Rebecca had restored it herself. I could still see her precision in the way each part had been placed, the quiet care in every adjustment. I almost closed it again. Almost decided I had been looking for something that wasn't there. But something held me there a moment longer. Not a thought, not quite instinct, just a sense that I hadn't looked closely enough. I ran my fingers along the inside edge of the case, slow, deliberate, and felt it. A slight variation in the surface, barely noticeable unless you knew how uniform it should be. I pressed gently, then again with more intention, and heard a soft click. The base shifted, not much, just enough to separate from the frame. A false floor, fitted cleanly, held in place by two small clips hidden along the sides. I lifted it carefully, the wood light in my hands, revealing a narrow compartment beneath. Inside, there was a folded sheet of paper sealed in a clear sleeve, along with a small bundle of documents tied together with a thin piece of string. For a moment, I didn't move, just looked at it, letting the reality of what I was seeing settle into place. Rebecca had built this, not as a repair, not as a restoration, but as preparation. I unfolded the letter first, her handwriting unmistakable, steady and precise, even in the small details. The paper was slightly worn at the edges, but the ink hadn't faded. She didn't begin with an explanation. She never did. She wrote simply, directly, about what she had noticed, about the way certain conversations had felt slightly off during the engagement dinner, about the questions that lingered longer than they should have. She didn't accuse, she observed. Then she wrote the line that held everything together. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. No urgency, no instruction, just certainty. She trusted that I would recognize the moment when it arrived. I set the letter down and opened the documents beside it. Names, dates, references to a property transaction from several years earlier, one that had ended in a dispute over access and control. Sophia's name appeared more than once, not prominently, not in a way that would stand out to someone who wasn't looking, but enough to establish a pattern. There were notes in Rebecca's hand, small annotations in the margins, connections drawn lightly, as if she had been mapping something she wasn't yet ready to define. I sat there for a long time, the clock still open in front of me, the quiet ticking continuing as if nothing had changed, but everything had. What I had suspected, what I had been documenting, piece by piece, now had a foundation that reached further back than I had known. Rebecca had seen the beginning of it, had recognized something before it fully formed, and instead of reacting, she had prepared. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back into the sleeve, then returned the documents to their place beneath the false floor. The compartment closed with the same soft click, seamless again, invisible unless you knew where to press. I set the clock back on the shelf above the bench, exactly where it had been, the face steady, the hands moving without hesitation. For the first time since this began, I wasn't waiting to understand anymore. I understood enough. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligned. And as I stood there in the quiet, listening to that steady, measured ticking, one thought settled in with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Rebecca hadn't left this for me to discover by accident. She had left it for the moment when everything was already in motion, and the only thing left to decide was when to bring it all into the light. Andrew came in on a Tuesday morning, earlier than usual, the air still cool, the front window catching a pale strip of light that hadn't fully settled into the room. He didn't bring coffee that day, didn't pause at the counter or glance around the way he normally would. Instead, he walked straight toward the back, stopping just short of the workbench, his hands resting flat against the edge, like he needed something solid to hold on to before he spoke. "We should talk about the shop," he said, not abruptly, but with a kind of careful steadiness that felt rehearsed. I kept working for a moment, finishing the small adjustment I had started, letting the silence stretch just enough to see if he would add anything on his own. When he didn't, I set the tool down and looked up at him. "All right," I said. "Talk." He nodded once, eyes shifting briefly toward the shelf above the bench before settling somewhere just past me. "Sophia thinks it might be time to start thinking about selling, or at least planning for that possibility." The words came out measured, spaced, as he had already gone over them more than once before saying them out loud. "Property values are strong right now, and she says it's not just about timing, it's about making the most of what you've built." I watched him as he spoke, not the words themselves, but the way he held them. There was tension in his shoulders, a slight hesitation before certain phrases, like he was stepping through something that didn't quite belong to him. "And what do you think?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He exhaled slowly, looked down at his hands. "I don't want to lose it," he said, quieter now. "I mean that. I know what it is, what it means. But—" He stopped there, the sentence left unfinished, hanging between us. Then he tried again. "She makes it sound like it's the responsible thing to do, like not thinking about it is just avoiding reality." That was the moment it settled. Not the idea itself, but how far it had traveled. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. It had become a position, something he was trying to reconcile inside himself. I stepped back slightly from the bench, giving him space without breaking the line between us. "Andrew," I said, "don't repeat something because it sounds reasonable. Tell me what you believe." He looked up then, really looked, for the first time since he walked in. There was something uncertain in his expression, something searching. "I don't know anymore," he admitted, the words quieter than anything he had said before. "I used to, but now it's like—" He shook his head slightly, unable to finish it. I let the silence settle again, not to pressure him, but to let the moment hold its shape. There were things I could have said then, explanations I could have given, pieces I could have placed in front of him to shift everything at once. But timing matters, and this wasn't the moment to show him everything. Not yet. "There are things happening around this that you don't see," I said finally, measured, deliberate. "I'm not asking you to understand it right now. I'm asking you to trust me long enough for me to show you when it matters." He held my gaze, searching for something solid in what I was offering. "How long?" he asked. "A few weeks," I said, no hesitation. "That's all I need." He didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly, then eased. "And Sophia?" he asked, quieter now. I shook my head once. Not yet. That part mattered, more than anything else. He needed to stand where he was, without knowing what was coming. After a moment, he nodded, not fully convinced, but willing enough to step back from the edge. "All right," he said, almost to himself. "A few weeks." I reached for the cloth beside the bench, wiping my hands slowly as I considered the next step. "I want you both to have dinner with me," I added, casual on the surface, but placed carefully. "Somewhere quiet, no interruptions. There are things we need to put on the table properly." He looked at me again, a flicker of something passing through his expression. Uncertainty, maybe, or anticipation. "What kind of things?" he asked. I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough for the question to settle without an answer. "The kind that shouldn't be rushed," I said, then turned back toward the bench, leaving the rest unsaid. Behind me, I could hear him shift his weight slightly, still standing there, still trying to place what had just changed. And, as the silence stretched again, one question remained suspended between us, not spoken, but impossible to ignore. What exactly was going to happen at that dinner, and who would still be standing the same way when it was over? The restaurant was quiet in the way places are when the lighting is soft, and the tables are spaced just far enough apart to keep conversations contained. A low hum of voices, the faint clink of glass. Nothing that carried too far. I arrived first. Not early, just on time. The clock wrapped carefully in a canvas cloth under my arm. When Andrew and Sophia walked in together, she smiled the way she always did in public. Composed, confident, already in control of how the moment would be seen. We sat. Small talk at first. The kind that fills space without meaning anything. Andrew kept his hands close to the table, fingers interlaced, his posture tighter than usual. Sophia ordered wine. Spoke lightly about the place, about how nice it was to finally sit down and talk about the future properly. I let her speak, let the rhythm settle before I reached down and placed the wrapped clock on the table between us. Her eyes moved to it immediately. "Is that Rebecca's?" she asked, her tone soft, almost appreciative. I nodded once, then unwrapped it slowly, the fabric sliding away to reveal the polished wood, the brass dial catching the warm light above us. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ticking was faint, but present, steady, measured. "She restored this herself," I said, not looking at either of them yet. "And she left something inside it." That was enough to shift the air at the table, not dramatically, just slightly, the way tension enters a room without being invited. I opened the back panel, pressed the hidden points until the compartment released with a quiet click. Sophia's expression didn't change at first, but her attention sharpened, the way it does when something moves from theory into reality. I took out the contents, the letter, the documents, and set them down carefully on the table, one piece at a time. "James, what is this?" she asked, still calm, but no longer casual. I didn't answer that question. Instead, I placed a second set of papers beside the first. Copies. Organized. Precise. "These are records," I said, my voice even. "Meetings you've had with Angela Price. Dates. Locations. Discussions about transferring ownership of my shop. Property valuations." I turned one page slightly so it faced her. "And this is a record of contact you've had with an insurance office, including information about my health that you had no right to access." Andrew's hands shifted, his fingers separating slowly as he looked down at the documents. He didn't speak, not yet. Sophia leaned back slightly, just enough to create space between herself and the table. "I think you're misunderstanding what you're looking at," she said. Measured, controlled. Those conversations were exploratory, hypothetical. I was trying to help Andrew think ahead. I nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. "Then help me understand this part," I said, sliding another document forward. "The proposed timeline for sale, contingent on transfer conditions. Your name is listed as the primary contact, not his." That was the first moment her composure shifted. Not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching closely, but enough. "That's taken out of context," she replied, her tone tightening just slightly. "It wasn't finalized. It wasn't even formal." "Of course it wasn't," I said, "because it required something that hadn't happened yet." Andrew looked up then, his eyes moving from the paper to her, then back again. "Sophia," he said, her name quieter than before, carrying more weight than anything else he had said that night. She turned toward him quickly. "Andrew, this is exactly what I was talking about. Your dad doesn't like change, so he's framing this." "Don't," he said, not loud, not forceful, but final. The silence that followed didn't need volume to hold its weight. It settled across the table, pressing everything else out of the way. Sophia's expression shifted again, this time more clearly, the control giving way to something sharper, more defensive. "I was trying to protect our future," she said, her voice no longer as smooth as it had been. You're both acting like I've done something wrong, when all I've done is think ahead. You didn't think ahead, I said, steady, without raising my voice. You moved ahead, without him, without me. Andrew's gaze stayed on her, searching, not for answers, but for something familiar that wasn't there anymore. The distance between them wasn't physical, it was something else, something that had already shifted before this moment, and was only now being seen clearly. Sophia looked at him, really looked this time, and for a brief second, there was no strategy in her expression, just calculation adjusting in real time. Then she stood, the chair moving back with a soft scrape against the floor. If this is how you both want to interpret things, then I don't see a reason to stay here, she said, collecting herself, rebuilding the composure piece by piece. I didn't stop her. I didn't need to. As she turned and walked away, the space she left behind didn't feel empty. It felt settled, like something that had been shifting for a long time had finally reached its position. Andrew didn't move right away. He sat there, looking down at the documents, then at the clock, then at me, his expression no longer uncertain, but not yet resolved. And as the ticking of that clock continued between us, steady and unchanged, one question remained in the silence, not about what had just happened, but about what it would mean once everything that followed began to unfold. Sophia didn't come back to the shop after that night, not the next day, not the week after. What followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It moved the way legal things tend to move, through papers, through calls that lasted longer than they needed to, through decisions made in rooms where no one raised their voice. Andrew handled most of it himself. He didn't explain everything to me, and I didn't ask him to. Some things need to be worked through without an audience. A few weeks later, he told me they had filed for divorce, his voice steady, but quieter than usual. She's not contesting it, he said, standing near the front counter, his hands resting on the wood like he needed to feel something familiar. I nodded once, not in approval, not in relief, just acknowledgement. There was nothing to celebrate in it, but there was a kind of clarity that hadn't been there before. He moved back into his old house, the one he had before the marriage, smaller, quieter, a place that didn't carry anyone else's expectations. For a while, he kept his distance, not out of avoidance, but because he needed time to sort through what had happened without everything being tied to it. Then, one Sunday morning, I heard his car again, the same sound it used to make as it pulled up outside, steady, familiar. He walked in without knocking, a paper bag in one hand, 2 cups of coffee in the other. He didn't say much, just set everything down on the counter the way he used to, like no time had passed at all. I didn't ask questions, didn't bring up the past few months. Instead, I unlocked the back door, stepped through, and left it open behind me. A simple invitation, the kind that doesn't need explanation. Andrew followed, slower this time, more deliberate. He stood at the edge of the workbench for a moment, looking at the tools, the drawers, the small details that hadn't changed. Then he rolled up his sleeves, not all the way at first, just enough to begin. "What are you working on?" he asked, his voice careful, but present. "A movement that needs patience," I said, sliding a small piece toward him. "Not speed." He picked it up, turned it between his fingers, studying it longer than necessary. The first few attempts were uneven, too much pressure, not enough control. I didn't correct him immediately, just watched, letting him adjust on his own. After a while, his hands slowed, his focus narrowing the way it used to when he was younger. Not perfect, but closer. We worked like that for a couple of hours, not speaking much, the sound of the ticking filling the space between us. At one point, he paused, looked at the piece in front of him, then at the shelf above the bench. "Mom would have done this faster," he said, a faint smile at the edge of it. "Your mother wasn't faster," I replied, adjusting a tool without looking up. "She was just more patient." He nodded. Like that made sense to him now, in a way it hadn't before. The room felt different. Not lighter. Not exactly, but settled. Like something that had been pulled out of alignment had been placed back where it belonged. Not perfectly, but enough to move forward. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, the work on the bench was cleaner, the movements more precise. Andrew set his tools down, wiped his hands, and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll come by next Sunday," he said, not as a question, not as a promise, just a statement. I didn't answer right away, just nodded once, the same way I always had. And as he stepped out into the quiet street, the sound of the door closing behind him was soft but certain. One thought remained, not about what we had fixed, but about what still needed time, and whether the rhythm we were finding again would hold, the way it used to, or change into something else entirely. There's something I came to understand through all of this, not in a single moment, but slowly, the way truth tends to settle when you stop trying to force it. Greed doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself as something you should fear. It comes in quietly, through reasonable questions, through careful concern, through conversations that feel helpful on the surface but carry something else underneath. If you're not paying attention, it doesn't look like a threat. It looks like logic. And love, real love, doesn't work that way. It doesn't measure. It doesn't calculate outcomes. It doesn't ask what something is worth before deciding whether it matters. It shows up, consistently, without needing to be justified. I've learned that protecting a family isn't always about confronting what's wrong the moment you see it. Sometimes it's about stepping back, watching closely, and choosing the right moment to act when it actually counts. The clock above my workbench still runs, steady, unchanged, the same measured rhythm it's kept for years. Every Sunday morning, I wind it the same way, the key turning slowly, the mechanism tightening just enough to carry it forward. The sound fills the room, not loud but constant, a reminder that time doesn't stop while you're deciding what to do with it. If you've ever seen something that didn't feel right but couldn't explain why, if you've ever hesitated, wondering whether you were overthinking or simply noticing what others chose to ignore, then you already understand more than you think. Pay attention to that. Don't dismiss it too quickly. Because sometimes the difference between losing everything and holding it together comes down to whether you're willing to see what's actually in front of you. And the question that stays with you, long after everything else settles, is this: when your moment comes, will you recognize it in time, or will it already be too late?